The Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. Introduction. To the Right Honourable John Lord Somers. My Lord, though the author has written a large dedication, yet that being addressed to a prince whom I am never likely to have the honour of being known to, a person besides, as far as I can observe, not at all regarded or thought on by any of our present writers, and I being wholly free from that slavery which booksellers usually lie under to the caprices of authors, I think it a wise piece of presumption to inscribe these papers to your lordship, and to implore your lordship's protection of them. God and your lordship know their faults and their merits, for as to my own particular, I am altogether a stranger to the matter, and though everybody else should be equally ignorant, I do not fear the sale of the book at all the worse upon that score. Your lordship's name on the front in capital letters will at any time get off one edition, neither would I desire any other help to grow an alderman than a patent for the sole privilege of dedicating to your lordship. I should now, in right of a dedicator, give your lordship a list of your own virtues, and at the same time be very unwilling to offend your modesty. But chiefly I should celebrate your liberality towards men of great parts and small fortunes, and give you broad hints that I mean myself. And I was just going on in the usual method to peruse 100 or 2 of dedications, and transcribe an abstract to be applied to your lordship, but I was diverted by a certain accident. For upon the covers of these papers I casually observed, written in large letters, the 2 following words, Detur Dinissimo, which for aught I knew might contain some important meaning. But it unluckily fell that none of the authors I employ understood Latin, though I have them often in pay to translate out of that language. I was therefore compelled to have recourse to the curate of our parish, who Englished it thus: "Let it be given to the worthiest," and his comment was that the author meant his work should be dedicated to the sublimest genius of the age for wit, learning, judgment, eloquence, and wisdom. I called at a poet's chamber, who worked for my shop, in an alley hard by, showed him the translation, and desired his opinion who it was that the author could mean. He told me after some consideration that vanity was a thing he abhorred, but by the description he thought himself to be the person aimed at, and at the same time he very kindly offered his own assistance gratis towards penning a dedication to himself. I desired him, however, to give a second guess. "Why then," said he, "it must be I, or my Lord Somers, for from thence I went to several other wits of my acquaintance, with no small hazard and weariness to my person, from a prodigious number of dark winding stairs, but found them all in the same story, both of your lordship and themselves. Now your lordship is to understand that this proceeding was not of my own invention, for I have somewhere heard it as a maxim that those to whom everybody allows the second place have an undoubted title to the first. This infallibly convinced me that your lordship was the person intended by the author, but being very unacquainted in the style and form of dedications, I employed those wits aforesaid to furnish me with hints and materials towards a panegyric upon your lordship's virtues. In 2 days they brought me 10 sheets of paper, filled up on every side. They swore to me that they had ransacked whatever could be found in the characters of Socrates, Aristides, Epaminondas, Cato, Tully, Atticus, and other hard names which I cannot now recollect. However, I have reason to believe they imposed upon my ignorance, because when I came to read over their collections there was not a syllable there but what I and everybody else knew as well as themselves. Therefore I grievously suspected cheat, and that these authors of mine stole and transcribed every word from the universal report of mankind, so that I took upon myself as 50 shillings out of pocket to no manner of purpose. If by altering the title I could make the same material serve for another dedication, as my betters have done, it would help to make up my loss. But I have made several persons dip here and there in those papers, and before they read 3 lines they have all assured me plainly that they cannot possibly be applied to any person besides your lordship. I expected indeed to have heard of your lordship's bravery at the head of an army, of your undaunted courage in mounting a breach or scaling a wall, or to have had your pedigree traced in a lineal descent from the house of Austria, or of your wonderful talent at dress and dancing, or your profound knowledge in algebra, metaphysics, and the oriental tongues, but to ply the world with an old beaten story of your wit and eloquence and learning and wisdom and justice and politeness and candor and evenness of temper in all scenes of life, of that great discernment in discovering and readiness in favoring deserving men with 40 other common topics, I confess I have neither conscience nor countenance to do it. Because there is no virtue either of a public or private life, which some circumstances of your own have not often produced upon the stage of the world, and those few which for want of occasions to exert them might otherwise have passed unseen or unobserved by your friends, your enemies have at length brought to light. It is true I should be very loath the bright example of your lordships' virtues should be lost after ages, both for their sake and your own, but chiefly because they will be so very necessary to adorn the history of a late reign, and that is another reason why I would forbear to make a recital of them here, because I have been told by wise men that as dedications have run for some years past, a good historian will not be apt to have recourse thither in search of characters. There is one point wherein I think we dedicators would do well to change our measures. I mean, instead of running on so far upon the praise of our patrons' liberality, to spend a word or two in admiring their patience. I can put no greater compliment on your lordships than by giving you so ample an occasion to exercise it at present. Though perhaps I shall not be apt to reckon much merit to your lordship upon that score, who, having been formerly used to tedious harangues, and sometimes to as little purpose, will be the readier to pardon this, especially when it is offered by one who is, with all respect and veneration, my lord, your lordship's most obedient and most faithful servant, the bookseller. The bookseller to the reader. It is now 6 years since these papers came first to my hand, which seems to have been about a 12-month after they were written, for the author tells us in his preface to the first treatise that he had calculated it for the year 1697, and in several passages of discourse as well as the second it appears they were written about that time. As to the author I can give no manner of satisfaction. However, I am credibly informed that this publication is without his knowledge, for he concludes the copy is lost, having lent it to a person since dead, and being never in possession of it after, so that whether the work received his last hand, or whether he intended to fill up the defective places, is like to remain a secret. If I should go about to tell the reader by what accident I became master of these papers, it would in this unbelieving age pass for little more than the cant or jargon of the trade. I therefore gladly spare both him and myself so unnecessary a trouble. There yet remains a difficult question, why I published them no sooner. I forbore upon 2 accounts. First, because I thought I had better work upon my hands, and secondly, because I was not without some hope of hearing from the author and receiving his directions. But I have been lately alarmed with intelligence of a surreptitious copy which a certain great wit had new polished and refined, or, as our present writers express themselves, fitted to the humour of our age, as they have already done with a great felicity to Don Quixote, Boccalini, La Bruyère, and other authors. However, I thought it fairer dealing to offer the whole work in its naturals. If any gentleman will please to furnish me with a key in order to explain the more difficult parts, I shall be very grateful and acknowledge the favour and print it by myself. The Epistle Dedicatory to His Royal Highness Prince Posterity. Sir, I here present your Highness with the fruits of a very few leisure hours, stolen from the short intervals of a world of business, and of an employment quite alien from such amusements as this. The poor production of that refuse of time which has lain heavy upon my hands during a long prorogation of Parliament, a great dearth of foreign news, and a tedious fit of rainy weather. For which and other reasons it cannot choose extremely to deserve such a patronage as that of your Highness, whose numberless virtues in so few years make the world look upon you as the future example to all princes. For although your Highness is hardly got clear of infancy, yet has the universal learned world already resolved upon appealing to your future dictates with the lowest and most resigned submission, fate having decreed your sole arbiter of the productions of human wit in this polite and most accomplished age. Methinks the number of appellants were enough to shock and startle any judge of a genius less unlimited than yours, but in order to prevent such glorious trials, the person, it seems, to whose care the education of your Highness is committed, has resolved, as I am told, to keep you in almost an universal ignorance of our studies, which it is your inherent birthright to inspect. It is amazing to me that this person should have assurance in the face of the sun to go about persuading your Highness that our age is almost wholly illiterate, and has hardly produced one writer upon any subject. I know very well that when your Highness shall come to riper years and has gone through the learning of antiquity, you will be too curious to neglect inquiring into the authors of the very age before you. And to think that this insolent, in the account he is preparing for your view, designs to reduce them to a number so insignificant as I am ashamed to mention, it moves my zeal and my spleen for the honour and interest of our vast flourishing body, as well as of myself, for whom I know by long experience he has professed and still continues a peculiar malice. It is not unlikely that, when your Highness will one day peruse what I am now writing, you may be ready to expostulate with your governor upon the credit of what I here affirm, and command him to show you some of our productions. To which he will answer, for I am well informed of his designs, by asking your Highness where they are and what is become of them, and pretend it a demonstration that there never were any, because they are not then to be found. Not to be found. Who has mislaid them? Are they sunk in the abyss of things? It is certain that in their own nature they were light enough to swim upon the surface for all eternity. Therefore the fault is in him who tied weights so heavy to their heels as to depress them to the centre. Is their very essence destroyed? Who has annihilated them? Were they drowned by purges or martyred by pipes? Who administered them to the posteriors of? But that it may no longer be a doubt with your Highness, who is to be the author of this universal ruin, I beseech you to observe that large and terrible scythe which your governor affects to bear continually about him. Be pleased to remark the length and strength, the sharpness and hardness of his nails and teeth. Consider his baneful, abominable breath, enemy to life and matter, infectious and corrupting, and then reflect whether it be possible for any mortal ink and paper of this generation to make a suitable resistance. Oh, that your Highness would one day resolve to disarm this usurping maître de palais of his furious engines, and bring your empire hors de page. It were endless to recount the several methods of tyranny and destruction which your governor is pleased to practice upon this occasion. His inveterate malice is such to the writings of our age that of several thousands produced yearly from this renowned city before the next revolution of the sun, there is not one to be heard of. Unhappy infants! Many of them barbarously destroyed before they have so much as learnt their mother tongue to beg for pity. Some he stifles in their cradles. Others he frights into convulsions whereof they suddenly die. Some he flays alive, others he tears limb from limb. Great numbers are offered to Moloch, and the rest, tainted by his breath, die of a languishing consumption. But the concern I have most at heart is for our corporation of poets, from whom I am preparing a petition to your Highness, to be subscribed with names of 136 of the first race, but whose immortal productions are never likely to reach your ears, though each of them is now an humble and an earnest appellant for the laurel, and has largely comely volumes ready to show for a support to his pretensions. The never-dying works of these illustrious persons your governor, sir, has devoted to unavoidable death, and your Highness is to be made believe that our age has never arrived at the honour to produce one single poet. We confess immortality to be a great and powerful goddess, but in vain we offer up to her our devotions and our sacrifices if your Highness's governor, who has usurped the priesthood, must by an unparalleled ambition and avarice wholly intercept and devour them. To affirm that our age is altogether unlearned and devoid of writers in any kind seems to be an assertion so bold and so false that I have been sometimes thinking the contrary may almost be proved by uncontrollable demonstration. It is true, indeed, that although their numbers be vast, and their productions numerous in proportion, yet are they hurried so hastily off the scene that they escape our memory and delude our sight. When I first thought of this address, I had prepared a copious list of titles to present your Highness as an undisputed argument for what I affirm. The originals were posted fresh upon all gates and corners of streets, but returning in a very few hours to take a review, they were all torn down and fresh ones in their places. I inquired after them among readers and booksellers, but I inquired in vain. The memorial of them was lost among men, their place was no more to be found, and I was laughed to scorn for a clown and a pedant, devoid of all taste and refinement, little versed in the course of present affairs, and that knew nothing of what had passed in the best companies of court and town. So that I can only avow in general to your Highness that we do abound in learning and wit, but to fix upon particulars is a task too slippery for my slender abilities. If I should venture in a windy day to affirm to your Highness that there is a large cloud near the horizon in the form of a bear, another in the zenith with the head of an ass, a third to the westward with claws like a dragon, and your Highness should in a few minutes think fit to examine the truth, it is certain that they would be all chanced in figure and position. New ones would arise, and all we could agree upon would be that clouds there were, but I was grossly mistaken in the zoography and topography of them. But your governor perhaps may still insist and put the question, what is then because of those immense bales of paper which must needs have been employed in such numbers of books? Can these also be wholly annihilated, and too of a sudden as I pretend? What shall I say in return of so invidious an objection? It all befits the distance between your Highness and me to send you for ocular conviction to a jakes or an oven, to the windows of a bawdy house, or to a sordid lanthorn. Books, like men, their authors have no more than one way of coming into the world, but there are 10,000 to go out of it and return no more. I profess to your Highness, in the integrity of my heart, that what I am going to say is literally true this minute I am writing. What revolutions may happen before it shall be ready for your perusal I can by no means warrant. However, I beg you to accept it as a specimen of our learning, our politeness, and our wit. I do therefore affirm upon the word of a sincere man that there is now actually in being a certain poet called John Dryden, whose translation of Virgil was lately printed in a large folio, well bound, and if diligent search were made, for aught I know, is yet to be seen. There is another called Nahum Tate, who is ready to make oath that he has caused many reams of verse to be published, whereof both himself and his bookseller, if lawfully required, can still produce authentic copies, and therefore wonders why the world is pleased to make such a secret of it. There is a third, known by the name of Tom Durfey, a poet of a vast comprehension, and universal genius, and most profound learning. There are also one Mr. Rymer and one Mr. Dennis, most profound critics. There is a person styled Dr. Bentley, who has wrote near 1,000 pages of immense erudition, giving a full and true account of a certain squabble of wonderful importance between himself and a bookseller. He is a writer of infinite wit and humour. No man rallies with a better grace and in more sprightly turns. Further, I avow to your Highness that with these eyes I have beheld the person of William Wotton, B.D., who has written a good-sized volume against a friend of your governor, from whom, alas, he must therefore look for little favour in a most gentlemanly style, adorned with utmost politeness and civility, replete with discoveries equally valuable for their novelty and use, and embellished with traits of wit so poignant and so apposite that he is a worthy yoke-mate to his forementioned friend. Why should I go upon farther particulars which might fill a volume with the just eulogies of my contemporary brethren? I shall bequeath this piece of justice to a larger work, wherein I intend to write a character of the present set of wits in our nation. Their persons I shall describe particularly, and at length their genius and understandings in miniature. In the meantime, I do here make bold to present your Highness with a faithful abstract drawn from the universal body of all arts and sciences, intended wholly for your service and instruction. Nor do I doubt in the least but your Highness will peruse it as carefully and make as considerable improvements as other young princes have already done by the many volumes of late years written for the help to their studies, that your Highness may advance in wisdom and virtue as well as years, and at last outshine all your royal ancestors, shall be the daily prayer of, Sir, your Highness's most devoted and C. December 1697. The Preface. The wits of the present age being so very numerous and penetrating, it seems the grandees of church and state begin to fall under horrible apprehensions, lest these gentlemen during the intervals of a long peace should find leisure to pick holes in the weak sides of religion and government. To prevent which there has been much thought employed of late upon certain projects for taking off the force and edge of those formidable inquirers from canvassing and reasoning upon such delicate points. They have at length fixed upon one, which will require some time as well as cost to perfect. Meanwhile the danger hourly increasing by new levies of wits, all appointed, as there is reason to fear, with pen, ink, and paper, which may at an hour's warning be drawn out into pamphlets and other offensive weapons ready for immediate execution, it was adjudged of absolute necessity that some present expedient be thought on till the main design can be brought to maturity. To this end, at a grand committee some days ago, this important discovery was made by a certain curious and refined observer, that seamen have a custom when they meet a whale to fling him out an empty tub, by way of amusement, to divert him from laying violent hands upon the ship. This parable was immediately mythologized. The whale was interpreted to be Hobbes's Leviathan, which tosses and plays with all other schemes of religion and government, whereof a great many are hollow and dry and empty and noisy and wooden and given to rotation. This is the Leviathan from whence the terrible wits of our age are said to borrow their weapons. The ship in danger is easily understood to be its old antitype, the Commonwealth. But how to analyze the tub was a matter of difficulty when, after long inquiry and debate, the literal meaning was preserved, and it was decreed that in order to prevent these leviathans from tossing and sporting with the Commonwealth, which of itself is too apt to fluctuate, they should be diverted from that game by a tale of a tub. And my genius being conceived to lie not unhappily that way, I had the honour done me to be engaged in the performance. This is the sole design in publishing the following treatise, which I hope will serve for an interim of some months to employ those unquiet spirits till the perfecting of that great work, into the secret of which it is reasonable the courteous reader should have some little light. It is intended that a large academy be erected, capable of containing 9,743 persons, which by modest computation is reckoned to be pretty near the current number of wits in this island. These are to be disposed into the several schools of this academy, and there pursued those studies to which their genius most inclines them. The undertaker himself will publish his proposals with all convenient speed, to which I shall refer the curious reader for a more particular account, mentioning at present only a few of the principal schools. There is first a large pederastic school with French and Italian masters. There is also the spelling school, a very spacious building, the school of looking-glasses, the school of swearing, the school of critics, the school of salivation, the school of hobby-horses, the school of poetry, the school of tops, the school of spleen, the school of gaming, with many others too tedious to recount. No person to be admitted member into any of these schools without an attestation under 2 sufficient persons' hands certifying him to be a wit. But to return, I am sufficiently instructed in the principal duty of a preface if my genius were capable of arriving at it. Thrice have I forced my imagination to take the tour of my invention, and thrice it has returned empty, the latter having been wholly drained by the following treatise. Not so my more successful brethren, the moderns, who will by no means let slip a preface or dedication without some notable distinguishing stroke to surprise the reader at the entry, and kindle a wonderful expectation of what is to ensue. Such was that of a most ingenious poet, who, soliciting his brain for something new, compared himself to the hangman and his patron to the patient. This was insigne resins in dictum ora alio. When I went through that necessary and noble course of study, I had the happiness to observe many such egregious touches which I shall not injure the authors by transplanting, because I have remarked that nothing is so very tender as a modern piece of wit, and which is apt to suffer so much in the carriage. Some things are extremely witty today, or fasting, or in this place, or at 8 o'clock, or over a bottle, or spoke by Mr. Whatchacallum, or in a summer's morning, any of which by the smallest transposal or misapplication is utterly annihilate. Thus wit has its walks and purlieus, out of which it may not stray the breadth of a hair, upon peril of being lost. The moderns have artfully fixed this mercury, and reduced it to the circumstances of time, place, and person. Such a jest there is that will not pass out of Covent Garden, such a one that is nowhere intelligible but at Hyde Park Corner. Now, though it sometimes tenderly affects me to consider that all the towardly passages I shall deliver in the following treatise will grow quite out of date, and relish with the first shifting of the present scene, yet I must needs subscribe to the justice of this proceeding, because I cannot imagine why we should be at expense to furnish wit for succeeding ages, when the former have made no sort of provision for ours, wherein I speak the sentiment of the very newest, and consequently the most orthodox refiners, as well as my own. However, being extremely solicitous that every accomplished person who has got into the taste of wit, calculated for this present month of August 1697, should descend to the very bottom of all the sublime throughout this treatise, I hold it fit to lay down this general maxim: whatever reader desires to have a thorough comprehension of an author's thoughts cannot take a better method than by putting himself into the circumstances and posture of life that the writer was in upon every important passage as it flowed from his pen, for this will introduce a parity and strict correspondence of ideas between the reader and the author. Now, to assist the diligent reader in so delicate an affair, as far as brevity will permit, I recollected that the shrewdest pieces of this treatise were conceived in bed in a garret. At other times, for a reason best known to myself, I thought fit to sharpen my invention with hunger, and in general the whole work was begun, continued, and ended under a long course of physic and a great want of money. Now I do affirm it will be absolutely impossible for the candid peruser to go along with me in a great many bright passages, unless upon the several difficulties emergent he will please to capacitate and prepare himself by these directions. And this I lay down as my principal postulatum. Because I professed to be a most devoted servant of all modern forms, I apprehend some curious wit may object against me for proceeding thus far in a preface without declaiming, according to custom, against the multitude of writers whereof the whole multitude of writers most reasonably complain. I am just come from perusing some hundreds of prefaces wherein the authors do at the very beginning address the gentle reader concerning this enormous grievance. Of these I have preserved a few examples. I shall set them down as near as my memory has been able to retain them. One begins thus: for a man to set up for a writer when the press swarms with. Another: the tax upon paper does not lessen the number of scribblers who daily pester. Another: when every little would-be wit takes pen in hand, 'tis in vain to enter the lists. Another: to observe what trash the press swarms with. Another: sir, it is merely in obedience to your commands that I venture into the public, for who upon a less consideration would be of a party with such a rabble of scribblers? Now I have two words in my own defence against this objection. First, I am far from granting the number of writers a nuisance to our nation, having strenuously maintained the contrary in several parts of the following discourse. Secondly, I do not well understand the justice of this proceeding, because I observe many of these polite prefaces to be not only from the same hand, but from those who are most voluminous in their several productions, upon which I shall tell the reader a short tale. A mountebank in Leicester Fields had drawn a huge assembly about him. Among the rest, A fat, unwieldy fellow, half stifled in the press, would be every fit, crying out, "Lord, what a filthy crowd is here! Pray, good people, give way a little. Bless need, what a devil has raked this rabble together! What squeezing is this? Honest friend, remove your elbow." At last a weaver that stood next him could hold no longer. "A plague confound you," said he, "for an overgrown sloven, and who in the devil's name, I wonder, helps to make up the crowd half so much as yourself? Don't you consider that you take up more room with that carcass than any 5 here? Is not the place as free for us as for you? Bring your own guts to a reasonable compass, and then I'll engage we shall have room enough for us all." There are certain common privileges of a writer, the benefit whereof I hope there will be no reason to doubt. Particularly that where I am not understood, it shall be concluded that something very useful and profound is couched underneath, and again that whatever word or sentence is printed in a different character shall be judged to contain something extraordinary, either of wit or sublime. As for the liberty I have thought fit to take of praising myself upon some occasions or none, I am sure it will need no excuse if a multitude of great examples be allowed sufficient authority. For it is here to be noted that praise was originally a pension paid by the world, but the moderns, finding the trouble and charge too great in collecting it, have lately bought out the fee simple, since which time the right of presentation is wholly in ourselves. For this reason it is that when an author makes his own eulogy, he uses a certain form to declare and insist upon his title, which is commonly these or the like words: "I speak without vanity," which I think plainly shows it to be a matter of right and justice. Now I do here once for all declare that in every encounter of this nature through the following treatise the form aforesaid is implied, which I mention to save the trouble of repeating it on so many occasions. It is a great ease to my conscience that I have written so elaborate and useful a discourse without one grain of satire intermixed, which is the sole point wherein I have taken leave to dissent from the famous originals of our age and country. I have observed some satirists to use the public much at the rate that pedants do a naughty boy ready horsed for discipline. First expostulate the case, then plead the necessity of the rod from great provocations, and conclude every period with a lash. Now if I know anything of mankind, these gentlemen might very well spare their reproof and correction, for there is not through all nature another so callous and insensible a member as the world's posteriors, whether you apply it to the toe or the birch. Besides, most of our late satirists seem to lie under a sort of mistake, that because nettles have the prerogative to sting, therefore all other weeds must do so too. I make not this comparison out of the least design to detract from these worthy writers, for it is well known among mythologists that weeds have the preeminence over all other vegetables. And therefore the first monarch of this island, whose taste and judgment were so acute and refined, did very wisely root out the roses from the collar of the order, and plant the thistles in their stead as the nobler flower of the two. For which reason it is conjectured by profounder antiquaries that the satirical itch, so prevalent in this part of our island, was first brought among us from beyond the Tweed. Here may it long flourish and abound, may it survive and neglect the scorn of the world, with as much ease and contempt as the world is insensible to the lashes of it. May their own dullness, or that of their party, be no discouragement for the authors to proceed. But let them remember it is with wits as with razors, which are never apt to cut those they are employed on as when they have lost their edge. Besides, those whose teeth are too rotten to bite are best of all things qualified to revenge that defect with their breath. I am not, like other men, to envy or undervalue the talents I cannot reach, for which reason I must needs bear a true honour to this large eminent sect of our British writers, and I hope this little panegyric will not be offensive to their ears, since it has the advantage of being only designed for themselves. Indeed, nature herself has taken order that fame and honour should be purchased at a better pennyworth by satire than by any other productions of the brain, the world being soonest provoked to praise by lashes, as men are to love. There was a problem in an ancient author, why dedications and other bundles of flattery run all upon stale, musty topics, without the smallest tincture of anything new, not only to the torment and nauseating of the Christian reader, but if not suddenly prevented, to the universal spreading of that pestilent disease, the lethargy in this island, whereas there is very little satire which has not something in it untouched before. The defects of the former are usually imputed to the want of invention among those who are dealers in that kind, but I think with a great deal of injustice, the solution being easy and natural, for the materials of panegyric, being very few in number, have been long since exhausted. For as health is but one thing, and has always been the same, whereas diseases are by thousands besides new and daily additions, so all the virtues that have been ever in mankind are to be counted upon a few fingers. But his follies and vices are innumerable, and time adds hourly to the heap. Now the utmost a poor poet can do is to get by heart a list of the cardinal virtues and deal them with his utmost liberality to his hero or his patron. He may ring the changes as far as it will go, and vary his phrase till he has talked round, but the reader quickly finds it is all pork, with a little variety of sauce. For there is no inventing terms of art beyond our ideas, and when ideas are exhausted, terms of art must be so too. But though the matter for panegyric were as fruitful as the topics of satire, yet would it not be hard to find out a sufficient reason why the latter will be always better received than the first. For this, being bestowed only upon one or a few persons at a time, is sure to raise envy and consequently ill words from the rest who have no share in the blessing. But satire, being levelled at all, is never resented for an offence by any, since every individual person makes bold to understand it of others, and very wisely removes his particular part of the burden upon the shoulders of the world, which are broad enough and able to bear it. To this purpose I have sometimes reflected upon the difference between Athens and England with respect to the point between us. In the Attic Commonwealth it was the privilege and birthright of every citizen and poet to rail around and in public, or to expose upon the stage by name any person they pleased, though of the greatest figure, without a Creon, and Hyperbolus, and Alcibiades, or Demosthenes. But on the other side, the least reflecting word let fall against the people in general was immediately caught up and revenged upon the authors, however considerable, for their quality or their merits. Whereas in England it is just the reverse of all this. Here you may securely display your utmost rhetoric against mankind in the face of the world. Tell them that all are gone astray, that there is none that doeth good, no, not one, that we live in the very dregs of time, that knavery and atheism are epidemic as the pox, that honesty is fled with Astrea, with any other commonplaces equally new and eloquent, which are furnished by the Splendida bills, and when you have done, the whole audience, far from being offended, shall return you thanks as a deliverer of precious and useful truths. Nay, further, it is but to venture your lungs, and you may preach in Covent Garden against foppery and fornication and something else, against pride and dissimulation and bribery at Whitehall. You may expose rapine and injustice in the Inns of Court Chapel, and in a city pulpit be as fierce as you please against avarice, hypocrisy, and extortion. It is but a ball, bandied to and fro, and every man carries a racket about him to strike it from himself among the rest of the company. But on the other side, whoever should mistake the nature of things so far as to drop but a single hint in public, how such a one starved half the fleet and half poisoned the rest, how such a one, from a true principle of love and honour, pays no debts but for wenches and play, how such a one runs out of his estate, how Paris, bribed by Juno and Venus, loath to offend either party, slept out the whole cause on the bench, or how such an orator makes long speeches in the Senate, with much thought, little sense, and to no purpose. Whoever, I say, should venture to be thus particular must expect to be imprisoned for scandalum magnatum, to have challenges sent him, to be sued for defamation, and to be brought before the bar of the house. But I forget that I am expatiating on a subject wherein I have no concern, having neither a talent nor an inclination for satire. On the other side, I am so easily satisfied with the whole present procedure of human things that I have been for some years preparing material towards a panegyric upon the world, to which I intended to add a second part entitled A Modest Defence of the Proceedings of the Rabble in All Ages. Both these I had thoughts to publish by way of appendix to the following treatise, but finding my commonplace book fill much slower than I had reason to expect, I have chosen to defer them to another occasion. Besides, I have been unhappily prevented in that design by a certain domestic misfortune, in the particulars whereof, though it would be very seasonable and much in the modern way to inform the gentle reader, it would also be of great assistance towards extending this preface into the size now in vogue, which by rule ought to be large in proportion, as the subsequent volume is small, yet I shall now dismiss our impatient reader from any further attendance at the porch, and having duly prepared his mind by preliminary discourse, shall gladly introduce him to the sublime mysteries that ensue. End of Introduction and Preface. Section 1 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. The Introduction. Whoever has an ambition to be heard in a crowd must press and squeeze and thrust and climb with indefatigable pains till he has exalted himself to a certain degree of altitude above them. Now in all assemblies, though you wedge them ever so close, we may observe this peculiar property, that over their heads there is room enough, but how to reach it is the difficult point, it being as hard to get quit of number as of hell. Efidere ad horas hoc opus hic labor est. To this end the philosopher's way in all ages has been by erecting certain edifices in the air. But whatever practice and reputation these kind of structures have formerly possessed, or may still continue in, not excepting that of Socrates, when he was suspended in a basket to help contemplation, I think, with due submission, they seem to labour under two inconveniences. First, that the foundations being laid too high, they have been often out of sight and ever out of hearing. Secondly, that the materials being very transitory have suffered much from inclemencies of air, especially in these northwest regions. Therefore, towards the just performance of this great work there remain but three methods that I can think on, whereof the wisdom of our ancestors, being highly sensible, has, to encourage all aspiring adventures, thought fit to erect 3 wooden machines for the use of those orators who desire to talk much without interruption. These are the pulpit, the ladder, and the stage itinerant. For as to the bar, though it be compounded of the same matter, and designed for the same use, it cannot, however, be well allowed the honour of a fourth, by reason of its level or inferior situation, exposing it to perpetual interruption from collaterals. Neither can the bench itself, though raised to a proper eminency, put in a better claim, whatever its advocates insist on. For if they please to look into the original design of its erection, and the circumstances or adjuncts subservient to that design, they will soon acknowledge the present practice exactly correspondent to the primitive institution, and both to answer the etymology of the name, which in the Phoenician tongue is a word of great signification, importing, if literally interpreted, the place of sleep, but in common acception, a seat well bolstered and cushioned for the repose of old and gouty limbs, senes et ut in otia tuta resident. Fortune being indebted to them this part of retaliation, that as formerly they have long talked whilst others slept, so now they may sleep as long whilst others talk. But if no other argument could occur to exclude the bench and the bar from the list of oratorical machines, it was sufficient that the admission of them would overthrow a number which I was resolved to establish, whatever argument it might cost me, in imitation of that prudent method observed by many other philosophers and great clerks, whose chief art and division has been to grow fond of some proper mystical number, which their imaginations have rendered sacred to a degree that they force common reason to find room for it in every part of nature, reducing, including, and adjusting every genus and species within that compass, by coupling some against their wills and banishing others at any rate. Now, among all the rest, the profound number 3 is that which has most employed my sublimest speculations, nor ever without wonderful delight. There is now in the press, and will be published next term, a panegyrical essay of mine upon this number, wherein I have by most convincing proofs not only reduced the senses and the elements under its banner, but brought over several deserters from its two great rivals, 7 and 9. Now the first of these oratorical machines, in place as well as dignity, is the pulpit. Of pulpits there are in this island several sorts, but I esteem only that made of timber by the Silver Caledonia, which agrees very well with our climate. If it be upon its decay, it is the better, both for conveyance of sound and for other reasons to be mentioned by and by. The degree of perfection in shape and size I take to consist in being extremely narrow, with little ornament, and best of all without a cover, for by ancient rule it ought to be the only uncovered vessel in every assembly where it is rightfully used, by which means, from its near resemblance to a pillory, it will ever have a mighty influence on human ears. Of ladders I need say nothing. It is observed by foreigners themselves, to the honour of our country, that we excel all nations in our practice and understanding of this machine. The ascending orators do not only oblige their audience in the agreeable delivery, but the whole world in their early publication of their speeches, which I look upon as the choicest treasury of our British eloquence, whereof I am informed that worthy citizen and bookseller Mr. John Dunton has made a faithful and a painful collection, which he shortly designs to publish in 12 volumes in folio, illustrated with copper plates, a work highly useful and curious, and altogether worthy of such a hand. The last engine of orators is the stage itinerant, erected with much sagacity, sub Jove pluvio in trivis et quadrivis. It is the great seminary of the two former, and its orators are sometimes preferred to the one and sometimes to the other, in proportion to their deservings, there being a strict perpetual intercourse between all three. From this accurate deduction it is manifest that for obtaining attention in public there is of necessity required a superior position of place. But although this point be generally granted, yet the cause is little agreed in, and it seems to me that very few philosophers have fallen into a true natural solution of this phenomenon. The deepest account, and the most fairly digested of any I have yet met with, is this, that air being a heavy body, and therefore, according to the system of Epicurus, continually descending, must needs be more so when laden and pressed down by words, which are also bodies of much weight and gravity, as is manifest from those deep impressions they make and leave upon us, and therefore must be delivered from a due altitude, or else they will neither carry a good aim nor fall down with a sufficient force. Corporeum quoque enim vocem constare fatendum est, et sonitum quoniam possunt impellere sensus. And I am the readier to favour this conjecture from a common observation, that in the several assemblies of these orators nature itself has instructed their hearers to stand with their mouths open and erected parallel to the horizon, so as they may be intersected by a perpendicular line from the zenith to the centre of the earth, in which position, if the audience be well compact, every one carries home a share, and little or nothing is lost. I confess there is something yet more refined in the contrivance and structure of our modern theatres. For first, the pit is sunk below the stage with due regard to the institution above deduced, that whatever weighty matter shall be delivered thence, whether it be lead or gold, may fall plump into the jaws of certain critics, as I think they are called, which stand ready open to devour them. Then the boxes are built round and raised to a level with the scene, in deference to the ladies, because that large portion of wit laid out in raising pruriences and protuberances is observed to run much upon a line, and ever in a circle. The whining passions and little starved conceits are gently wafted up by their own extreme levity to the middle region, and there fix and are frozen by the frigid understandings of the inhabitants. Bombast and buffoonery, by nature lofty and light, soar highest of all, and would be lost in the roof if the prudent architect had not, with much foresight, contrived for them a fourth place, called the 12-penny gallery, and there planted a suitable colony, who greedily intercept them in their passage. Now this physico-logical scheme of oratorical receptacles or machines contains a great mystery, being a type, a sign, an emblem, a shadow, a symbol, bearing analogy to the spacious commonwealth of writers, and to those methods by which they must exalt themselves to a certain eminency above the inferior world. By the pulpit are adumbrated the writings of our modern saints in Great Britain, as they have spiritualized and refined them from the dross and grossness of sense and human reason. The matter, as we have said, is of rotten wood, and that upon two considerations: because it is the quality of rotten wood to light in the dark, and secondly, because its cavities are full of worms, which is a type with a pair of handles, having a respect to the two principal qualifications of the orator, and the two different fates attending upon his works. The latter is an adequate symbol of faction and of poetry, to both of which so noble a number of authors are indebted for their fame. Of faction, because; of poetry, because its orators do perorare with a song, and because, climbing up by slow degrees, fate is sure to turn them off before they can reach within many steps of the top, and because it is a preferment attained by transferring of propriety and confounding of meum and tuum. Under the stage itinerant are couched those productions designed for the pleasure and delight of mortal man, such as 6 pennyworth of wit, Westminster drolleries, delightful tales, complete jesters, and the like, by which the writers of and for Grub Street have in these later ages so nobly triumphed over time, have clipped his wings, pared his nails, filed his teeth, turned back his hourglass, blunted his scythe, and drawn the hobnails out of his shoes. It is under this class I have presumed to list my present treatise, being just come from having the honour conferred upon me to be adopted a member of that illustrious fraternity. Now I am not unaware the productions of the Grub Street Brotherhood have of late years fallen under many prejudices, nor how it has been the perpetual employment of 2 junior start-up societies to ridicule them and their authors as unworthy their established post in the commonwealth of wit and learning. Their own consciences will easily inform them whom I mean, nor has the world been so negligent a looker on as not to observe the continual efforts made by the societies of Gresham and of Wills, to edify a name and reputation upon the ruin of ours. And this is yet a more feeling grief to us, upon the regards of tenderness as well as of justice, when we reflect on their proceedings not only as unjust, but as ungrateful, undutiful, and unnatural. For how can it be forgot by the world or themselves, to say nothing of our own records, which are full and clear in the point, that they both are seminaries, not only of our planting, but our watering too? I am informed our 2 rivals have lately made an offer to enter into the lists with united forces, and challenge us to a comparison of books, both as to weight and number. In return to which, with license from our President, I humbly offer 2 answers. First, we say the proposal is like that which Archimedes made upon a smaller affair, including an impossibility in the practice. For where can they find scales of capacity enough for the first, or an arithmetician of capacity enough for the second? Secondly, we are ready to accept the challenge, but with this condition, that a third indifferent person be assigned, to whose impartial judgment it shall be left to decide which society each book, treatise, or pamphlet do most properly belong to. This point, God knows, is very far from being fixed at present, for we are ready to produce a catalogue of some thousands, which, in all common justice, ought to be entitled to our fraternity, but by the revolted and new-fangled writers most perfidiously ascribed to the others. Upon all which we think it very unbecoming our prudence that the determination should be remitted to the authors themselves, when our adversaries, by brigging and caballing have caused so universal a defection from us, that the greatest part of our society has already deserted to them, and our nearest friends begin to stand aloof as if they were half ashamed to own us. This is the utmost I am authorized to say upon so ungrateful and melancholy a subject, because we are extremely unwilling to inflame a controversy whose continuance may be so fatal to the interests of us all, desiring much rather that things be amicably composed, and we shall so far advance on our side as to be ready to receive the two prodigals with open arms, whenever they shall think fit to return from their husks and their harlots, which I think from the present course of their studies they most properly may be said to be engaged in, and like an indulgent parent continue to them our affection and our blessing. But the greatest maim given to that general reception which the writings of our society have formerly received, next to the transitory state of all sublunary things, has been a superficial vein among many readers of the present age, who will by no means be persuaded to inspect beyond the surface and the rind of things, whereas wisdom is a fox, who after long hunting will at last cost you the pains to dig out. It is a cheese which by how much the richer has the thicker, the homelier, and the coarser coat, and whereof to a judicious palate the maggots are the best. It is a sack posset, wherein the deeper you go you will find it the sweeter. Wisdom is a hen, whose cackling we must value and consider, because it is attended with an egg. But then lastly it is a nut, which, unless you choose with judgment, may cost you a tooth, and pay you with nothing but a worm. In consequence of these momentous truths, Grabaian sages have always chosen to convey their precepts and their arts shut up within the vehicles of types and fables, which, having been perhaps more careful and curious in adorning than was altogether necessary, it has fared with these vehicles after the usual fate of coaches over finely painted and gilt, that the transitory gazers have so dazzled their eyes and filled their imaginations with the outward lustre as neither to regard nor consider the person or the parts of the owner within. A misfortune we undergo with somewhat less reluctancy, because it has been common to us with Pythagoras, Aesop, Socrates, and other of our predecessors. However, that neither the world nor ourselves may any longer suffer by such misunderstandings, I have been prevailed on, after much importunity from my friends, to travail in a complete and laborious dissertation upon the prime productions of our society, which, besides their beautiful externals for the gratification of superficial readers, have darkly and deeply couched under them the most finished and refined systems of all sciences and arts, as I do not doubt to lay open by untwisting or unwinding, and either to draw up by exaltation or display by incision. This great work was entered upon some years ago by one of our most eminent members. He began with the history of Reynard the Fox, but neither lived to publish his essay, nor to proceed farther in so useful an attempt, which is very much to be lamented, because the discovery he made and communicated to his friends is now universally received. Nor do I think any of the learned will dispute that famous treatise to be a complete body of civil knowledge, and the revelation, or rather the apocalypse, of all state arcana. But the progress I have made is much greater, having already finished my annotations upon several dozens, from some of which I shall impart a few hints to the candid reader as far as will be necessary to the conclusion at which I aim. The first piece I have handled is that of Tom Thumb, whose author was a Pythagorean philosopher. This dark treatise contains the whole scheme of the metempsychosis, deducing the progress of the soul through all her stages. The next is Dr. Faustus, penned by Artifius, an author Bonoe, Notoe, and an Adeptus. He published it in the 984th year of his age. This writer proceeds wholly by reincrudation, or in the Via Humida, and the marriage between Faustus and Helen does most conspicuously delucidate the fermenting of the male and female dragon. Whittington and his cat is the work of that mysterious Rabbi Jehuda Hanasai, containing a defence of the Gemara of the Jerusalem Mishnah, and is just a preference to that of Babylon, contrary to the vulgar opinion. The Hind and Panther. This is the masterpiece of a famous writer now living, intended for a complete abstract of 16,000 schoolmen from Scotus to Bellarmine. Tommy Potts, another piece, supposed by the same hand by way of supplement to the former. The Wise Men of Gotham cum appendis. This is a treatise of immense erudition, being the great original and fountain of those arguments bandied about both in France and England for a just defence of modern learning and wit against the presumption, the pride, and the ignorance of the ancients. This unknown author hath so exhausted the subject that a penetrating reader will easily discover whatever has been written, since upon that dispute to be little more than repetition. An abstract of this treatise has been lately published by a worthy member of our society. These notices may serve to give the learned reader an idea as well as a taste of what the whole work is likely to produce, wherein I have now altogether circumscribed my thoughts and my studies, and if I can bring it to a perfection before I die, shall reckon I have well employed the poor remains of an unfortunate life. This indeed is more than I can justly expect from a quill worn to the pith in the service of the state, in pros and cons upon popish plots, and meal tubs, and exclusion bills, and passive obedience, and addresses of lives and fortunes, and prerogative and property, and liberty of conscience, and letters to a friend. From an understanding and a conscience, threadbare and ragged with perpetual turning, from a head broken in 100 places by the malignance of the opposite factions, and from a body spent with poxes ill cured by trusting to bawds and surgeons who, as is afterwards appeared, were professed enemies to me and the government, and revenged their parties' quarrel upon my nose and shins. 411 pamphlets have I written under 3 reigns, and for the service of 36 factions, but finding the state has no farther occasion for me and my ink, I retire willingly to draw it out into speculations more becoming a philosopher, having to my unspeakable comfort passed a long life with a conscience void of offence towards God and towards men. But to return, I am assured from the reader's candour that the brief specimen I have given will easily clear all the rest of a society's productions from an aspersion grown, as it is manifest, out of envy and ignorance, that they are of little farther use or value to mankind, beyond the common entertainment of their wit and their style, for these I am sure have never yet been disputed by our keenest adversaries, in both which, as well as the more profound and most mystical part, I have throughout this treatise closely followed the most applauded originals, and to render all complete I have with much thought and application of mind so ordered that the chief title prefixed to it, I mean that under which I design it shall pass in the common conversation of court and town, is modelled exactly after the manner peculiar to our society. I confess to have been somewhat liberal in the business of titles, having observed the humour of multiplying them to bear great vogue among certain writers whom I exceedingly reverence. And indeed it seems not unreasonable that books, the children of the brain, should have the honour to be christened with variety of names as well as other infants of quality. Our famous Dryden has ventured to proceed a point farther, endeavouring to introduce also a multiplicity of godfathers, which is an improvement of much more advantage upon a very obvious account. It is a pity this admirable invention has not been better cultivated, so as to grow by this time into general imitation when such an authority serves it for a precedent. Nor have my endeavours been wanting to second so useful an example, but it seems there is an unhappy expense usually annexed to the calling of a godfather, which was clearly out of my head, as it is very reasonable to believe. Where the pinch lay I cannot certainly affirm, but having employed a world of thoughts and pains to split my treatise into 40 sections, and having entreated 40 lords of my acquaintance that they would do me the honour to stand, they all made it matter of conscience, and sent me their excuses. End of section 1.
Section 2, The Tale of a Tub, by Jonathan Swift.
Once upon a time there was a man who had 3 sons by one wife, and all at a birth. neither could the midwife tell certainly which was the eldest. Their father died while they were young, and upon his deathbed, calling the lads to him, spoke thus: "Sons, because I have purchased no estate, nor was born to any, I have long considered of some good legacies to bequeath you, and at last, with much care as well as expense, have provided each of you, here they are, a new coat. Now you are to understand that these coats have two virtues contained in them. One is that with good wearing they will last you fresh and sound as long as you live. The other is that they will grow in the same proportion with your bodies, lengthening and widening of themselves, so as to be always fit. Here, let me see them on you before I die. So very well. Pray, children, wear them clean and brush them often. You will find in my will, here it is, full instructions in every particular concerning the wearing and management of your coats, wherein you must be very exact to avoid the penalties I have appointed for every transgression or neglect upon which your future fortunes will entirely depend. I have also commanded in my will that you should live together in one house like brethren and friends, for then you will be sure to thrive and not otherwise." Here the story says this good father died, and the three sons went all together to seek their fortunes. I shall not trouble you with recounting what adventures they met for the first 7 years, any farther than by taking notice that they carefully observed their father's will, and kept their coats in very good order; that they travelled through several countries, encountered a reasonable quantity of giants, and slew certain dragons. Being now arrived at the proper age for producing themselves, they came up to town and fell in love with the ladies, but especially 3, who about that time were in chief reputation, the Duchess d'Argent, Madame de Grand Titre, and the Countess d'Orgueil. On their first appearance, our 3 adventurers met with a very bad reception, and soon, with great sagacity, guessing out the reason, they quickly began to improve in the good qualities of the town. They wrote and rallied and rhymed and sung and said nothing. They drank and fought and slept and swore and took snuff. They went to new plays on the first night, haunted the chocolate houses, beat the watch. They built hackney coachmen, ran in debt with shopkeepers, and lay with their wives. They killed bailiffs, kicked fiddlers downstairs, ate at Locket's, loitered at Will's. They talked of the drawing-room and never came there, dined with lords they never saw, whispered a duchess and spoke never a word, exposed the scrawls of their laundress for billet-doux or quality, came ever just from court and were never seen in it, attending the levee sub dio, got a list of peers by heart in one company, and with great familiarity withheld them in another. Above all, they constantly attended those committees of senators who are silent in the House and loud in the coffee-house, where they nightly adjourn to chew the cud of politics, and are encompassed with a ring of disciples who lie in wait to catch up their droppings. The 3 brothers had acquired 40 other qualifications of the like stamp too tedious to recount, and by consequence were justly reckoned the most accomplished persons in town. But all would not suffice, and the ladies aforesaid continued still inflexible. To clear up which difficulty, I must, with the reader's good leave and patience, have recourse to some points of weight which the authors of that age have not sufficiently illustrated. For about this time it happened a sect arose, whose tenets obtained and spread very far, especially in the grand monde, and among everybody of good fashion. They worshipped a sort of idol, who, as their doctrine delivered, did daily create men by a kind of manufactory operation. This idol they placed in the highest parts of the house on an altar erected about 3 feet. He was shown in the posture of a Persian emperor, sitting on a superficies, with his legs interwoven under him. This god had a goose for his ensign, whence it is that some learned men pretend to deduce his original from Jupiter Capitolinus. At his left hand, beneath the altar, hell seemed to open and catch at the animals the idol was creating, to prevent which certain of his priests hourly flung in pieces of the uninformed mass or substance, and sometimes whole limbs already enlivened, which that horrid gulf insatiably swallowed, terrible to behold. The goose was also held a subaltern divinity, or Deus Minorum Gentium, before whose shrine was sacrificed that creature whose hourly food is human gore, and who is in so great renown abroad for being the delight and favourite of the Egyptian Cercopithecus. Millions of these animals were cruelly slaughtered every day to appease the hunger of that consuming deity. The chief idols also worshipped as the inventor of the yard and the needle, whether as the god of seamen or on account of certain other mystical attributes, hath not been sufficiently cleared. The worshippers of this deity had also a system of their belief which seemed to turn upon the following fundamental. They held the universe to be a large suit of clothes which invests everything, that the earth is invested by the air is invested by the stars, and the stars are invested by the primum mobile. Look on this globe of earth, you will find it to be a very complete and fashionable dress. What is that which some call land but a fine coat faced with green, or the sea but a waistcoat of water tabby? Proceed to the particular works of the creation, you will find how curious journeymen nature hath been to trim up the vegetable bow. Observe how sparkish a periwig adorns the head of a beech, and what a fine doublet of white satin is worn by the birch. To conclude from all, what is man himself but a micro-coat, or rather a complete suit of clothes with all its trimmings? As to his body there can be no dispute, but examine even the acquirements of his mind. You will find them all contribute in their order towards furnishing out an exact dress. To instance no more, is not religion a cloak, honesty a pair of shoes worn out in the dirt, self-love a surtout, vanity a shirt, and conscience a pair of breeches, which, though a cover for lewdness as well as nastiness, is easily slipped down for the service of both? This postulata being admitted, it would follow in due course of reasoning that those beings which the world calls improperly suits of clothes are in reality the most refined species of animals, or to proceed higher, that they are rational creatures or men. For is it not manifest that they live and move and talk and perform all other offices of human life? Are not beauty and wit and mien and breeding their inseparable proprieties? In short, we see nothing but them, hear nothing but them. It is not they who walk the streets, fill up Parliament, coffee, play, bawdy houses. It is true indeed that these animals, which are vulgarly called suits of clothes or dresses, do, according to certain compositions, receive different appellations. If one of them be trimmed up with a gold chain and a red gown and a white rod and a great horse, it is called a Lord Mayor. If certain ermines and furs be placed in a certain position, we style them a judge. And so an apt conjunction of lawn and black satin we entitle a bishop. Others of these professors, though agreeing in the main system, were yet more refined upon certain branches of it, and held that man was an animal compounded of two dresses, the natural and the celestial suit, which were the body and the soul; that the soul was the outward, and the body the inward clothing; that the latter was extra duce, but the former of daily creation and circumfusion. This last they proved by Scripture, because in them we live and move, and have our being, as likewise by philosophy, because they are all in all, and all in every part. Besides, said they, separate these two, and you will find the body to be only a senseless, unsavoury carcass. By all which it is manifest that the outward dress must needs be the soul. To this system of religion were tagged several subaltern doctrines, which were entertained with great vogue, as particularly the faculties of the mind were deduced by the learned among them in this manner. Embroidery was sheer wit, gold fringe was agreeable conversation, gold lace was repartee, a huge long periwig was humour, and a coat full of powder was very good raillery. All which required abundance of finesse, delicatesse to manage with advantage, as well as a strict observance after times and fashions. I have with much pains in reading collected out of ancient authors this short summary of a body of philosophy and divinity which seems to have been composed by a vein and race of thinking very different from any other systems, either ancient or modern. And it was not merely to entertain or satisfy the reader's curiosity, but rather to give him light into several circumstances of the following story, that, knowing the state of dispositions and opinions in an age so remote, he may better comprehend those great events which were the issue of them. I advise, therefore, the courteous reader to peruse with a world of application again and again whatever I have written upon this matter. And so, leaving these broken ends, I carefully gather up the chief thread of my story and proceed. These opinions, therefore, are so universal, as well as the practices of them, among the refined part of court and town, that our three brother adventurers, as their circumstances then stood, are strangely at a loss. For on the one side, the three ladies they addressed themselves to, whom we have named already, were ever at the very top of the fashion, and abhorred all that were below it, but the breadth of a hair. On the other side, their father's will was very precise, and it was the main precept in it, with the greatest penalties annexed, not to add to or diminish from their coats one thread without a positive command in the will. Now the coats their father had left them were, it is true, of very good cloth, and besides so neatly sewn you would swear they were all of a piece, but at the very same time very plain, with little or no ornament, and it happened that before they were a month in town great shoulder knots came up. Straight all the world was shoulder knots. No approaching the ladies' ruelles without the quota of shoulder knots. "That fellow," cries one, "has no soul. Where is his shoulder knot?" Our three brethren soon discovered their want by sad experience, meeting in their walks with 40 mortifications and indignities. If they went to the playhouse, the doorkeeper showed them into the 12-penny gallery. If they called a boat, said the waterman, "I am for a sculler." If they stepped into the Rose to take a bottle, the drawer would cry, "Friend, we sell no ale." If they went to visit a lady, a footman met them at the door with, "Pray send up your message." In this unhappy case they went immediately to consult their father's will, read it over and over, but not a word of the shoulder knot. What should they do? What temper should they find? Obedience was absolutely necessary, and yet shoulder knots appeared extremely requisite. After much thought, one of the brothers, who happened to be more book learned than the other two, said he had found an expedient. "It is true," said he, "there is nothing here in this will, totidem verbis, making mention of shoulder knots, but I dare conjecture we may find them inclusive, or totidem syllabis." This distinction was immediately approved by all, and so they fell again to examine the will. But their evil star had so directed the matter that the first syllable was not to be found in the whole writing, upon which disappointment he who found the former evasion took heart and said, "Brothers, there is yet hopes, for though we cannot find them totidem verbis nor totidem syllabis, I dare engage we shall make them out tertio modo or totidem litteris." This discovery was also highly commended, upon which they fell once more to the scrutiny, and soon picked out SHOULDER, when the same planet, enemy to their repose, had wonderfully contrived that a K was not to be found. Here was a weighty difficulty. But the distinguishing brother, for whom we shall hereafter find a name, now his hand was in, proved by a very good argument that K was a modern illegitimate letter, unknown to the learned ages, nor anywhere to be found in ancient manuscripts. "It is true," said he, "the word calende had in QVC been sometimes writ with a K, but erroneously, for in the best copies it is ever spelt with a C, and by consequence it was a gross mistake in our language to spell not with a K, but that from henceforward he would take care it should be writ with a C." Upon this all further difficulty vanished. Shoulder knots were made clearly out to be jure paterno, and our three gentlemen swaggered with as large and as flaunting ones as the best. But as human happiness is of a very short duration, so in those days were human fashions upon which it entirely depends. Shoulder knots had their time, and we must now imagine them in their decline, for a certain lord came just from Paris with 50 yards of gold lace upon his coat, exactly trimmed after the court fashion of that month. In 2 days all mankind appeared closed up in bars of gold lace. Whoever durst peep abroad without his complement of gold lace was as scandalous as and as ill received among the women. What should our three knights do in this momentous affair? They had sufficiently strained a point already in the affair of shoulder knots. Upon recourse to the will, nothing appeared there but altum silentium. That of the shoulder knots was a loose, flying, circumstantial point, but this of gold lace seemed too considerable an alteration without better warrant. It did aliquo modo essenti adherere, and therefore required a positive precept. But about this time it fell out that the learned brother aforesaid had read Aristotelis' Dialectica, and especially that wonderful piece De Interpretatione, which was the faculty of teaching its readers to find out a meaning in everything but itself, like commentators on the Revelations, who perceive prophets without understanding a syllable of the text. "Brothers," said he, "you are to be informed that of wills, due sunt genera, non capitori and scriptori, that in the scriptori we'll here before us there is no precept or mention about gold lace, conceditur, but si idem affirmator de nuncupatorio negetur. For, brothers, if you remember, we heard a fellow say when we were boys that he heard my father's man say that he heard my father say that he would advise his sons to get gold lace on their coats as soon as ever they could procure money to buy it." "That is very true," cries the others. "I remember it perfectly well," said the third. And so without more ado they got the largest gold lace in the parish, and walked about as fine as lords. A while after there came up all in fashion a pretty sort of flame-coloured satin for linings, and the mercer brought a pattern of it immediately to our three gentlemen. "And please your worship," said he, "my Lord C. and Sir J. W. had linings out of this very piece last night. It takes wonderfully, and I shall not have a remnant left enough to make my wife a pincushion by tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Upon this they fell again to rummage the will, because the present case also required a positive precept, the lining being held by orthodox writers to be of the essence of the coat. After long search they could fix upon nothing to the matter in hand, except a short advice in their father's will to take care of fire, and put out their candles before they went to sleep. This, though a good deal for the purpose, and helping very far towards self-conviction, yet not seeming wholly of force to establish a command, and being resolved to avoid farther scruple, as well as future occasion for scandal, says he that was the scholar, "I remember to have read in wills of a codicil annexed, which is indeed a part of the will, and what it contains hath equal authority with the rest. Now I have been considering of this same will here before us, and I cannot reckon it to be complete for want of such a codicil. I will therefore fasten one in its proper place very dexterously. I have had it by me some time. It was written by a dog-keeper of my grandfather's, and talks a great deal, as good luck would have it, of this very flame-coloured satin." The project was immediately approved by the other two. An old parchment scroll was tagged on according to art in the form of a codicil annexed, and the satin bought and worn. Next winter a player, hired for the purpose by the corporation of fringe makers, acted his part in a new comedy, all covered with silver fringe, and according to the laudable custom gave rise to that fashion. Upon which the brothers, consulting their father's will, to their great astonishment found these words: "Item, I charge and command my said three sons to wear no sort of silver fringe upon or about their said coats, and C, with a penalty in case of disobedience, too long here to insert." However, after some pause, the brother so often mentioned for his erudition, who was well skilled in criticisms, had found in a certain author, which he said should be nameless, that the same word which in the will is called fringe does also signify a broomstick, and doubtless ought to have the same interpretation in this paragraph. This another of the brothers disliked, because of that epithet silver, which could not be humbly conceived in propriety of speech be reasonably applied to a broomstick. But it was replied upon him that this epithet was understood in a mythological and allegorical sense. However, he objected again why their father should forbid them to wear a broomstick on their coats, a caution that seemed unnatural and impertinent, upon which he was taken up short, as one that spoke irreverently of a mystery which doubtless was very useful and significant, but ought not to be over curiously pried into or nicely reasoned upon. And in short, their father's authority being now considerably sunk, this expedient was allowed to serve as a lawful dispensation for wearing their full proportion of silver fringe. A while after was revived an old fashion, long antiquated, of embroidery with Indian figures of men, women, and children. Here they had no occasion to examine the will. They remembered but too well how their father had always abhorred this fashion, that he made several paragraphs on purpose, importing his utter detestation of it, bestowing his everlasting curse to all sons whenever they should wear it. For all this, in a few days they appeared higher in the fashion than anybody else in the town, but they solved the matter by saying that these figures were not at all the same with those that were formerly worn and were meant in the will. Besides, they did not wear them in that sense, as forbidden by their father, and as they were a commendable custom and of great use to the public. That these rigorous clauses in the will did therefore require some allowance, and a favourable interpretation, and ought to be understood cum grano salis. But fashions perpetually altering that age, the scholastic brother grew weary of searching further evasions and solving everlasting contradictions. Resolved, therefore, at all hazards to comply with the modes of the world, they concerted matters together, and agreed unanimously to lock up their father's will in a strong box, brought out of Greece or Italy, I have forgot which, and trouble themselves no farther to examine it, but only refer to its authority whenever they thought fit. In consequence whereof, a while after it grew a general mode to wear an infinite number of points, most of them tagged with silver, upon which the scholar pronounced ex cathedra that points were absolutely jure paterno, as they might very well remember. It is true indeed, the fashion prescribed somewhat more than were directly named in the will. However, that they, as heirs general of their father, had power to make and add certain clauses for public emolument, though not deducible todidem verbis from the letter of the will, or else multa absurda sequerentur, this was understood for canonical, and therefore on the following Sunday they came to church all covered with points. The learned brother so often mentioned was reckoned the best scholar in all that or the next street to it, insomuch as, having run something behindhand with the world, he obtained the favour from a certain lord to receive him into his house and to teach his children. A while after the lord died, and he, by long practice upon his father's will, found the way of contriving a deed of conveyance of that house to himself and his heirs, upon which he took possession, turned the young squires out, and received his brothers in their stead.
End of section 2.